Welcome everyone to this first webinar in the CyCAT series. I should introduce myself first. My name is Rovatsos. I work at the University of Edinburgh. I'm an AI researcher and I'm part of this CyCAT project. So this is the first webinar in the series, and the title is Toward Ethical AI, with a somewhat provocative subtitle, No More AI Ethics, Please. And I'll get on to what that means in a moment. So I should say a little bit about the project, which is a cross-European collaboration with the goal of establishing a community across Europe on algorithmic transparency. And so we really care about AI ethical issues, of course. And there will be a series of webinars out of which this is the first one. So I should also say this is a rather informal talk. There's not a lot of technical content. I will talk a little bit about some general points around AI ethics and ethical AI, and why we should try to do more ethical AI rather than just AI ethics, and I'll try to explain the difference. And I'll talk a little bit about work done here in Edinburgh. And at the end of the webinar, I'm of course very happy to take some questions. So as most people attending this will know, AI is of course all the rage at the moment. AI is increasingly adopted in a number of different industries. It increasingly has more and more real-world impact. But the news about AI are not always positive. In fact, you will probably have seen yourselves quite a lot of news stories and media reports on not so positive things that happen through the use of AI. So just a few examples on this slide. You can see the case where Facebook translated good morning in Arabic into attack them, and that led to an arrest of the people who posted this. Another interesting case was the one of an AI algorithm that could detect the sexual orientation of people just based on their a picture of their face. And the third one was a problem with self-driving cars, where cyclists on the road hadn't been considered enough in the testing, and it was discovered that there could be significant risks from having self-driving cars around when there are cyclists on the road. So in general, one could say that these different possible negative impacts are likely to come in 4 different areas, which I've highlighted on this slide. So the first one is exploitation. So as algorithms affect how people work, for example, on platforms like Uber or other sharing economy applications, of course there can be issues of exploitation of workers, because how benefit is distributed by an algorithm is something that can be quite opaque. And there have been protests, for example, by Uber drivers claiming that the algorithm is doing unfair things towards them. A second one, quite prominent case, is discrimination. So there has been the famous Compass case, where a tool that was used to predict recidivism among offenders. So it turned out that this predicted a much higher probability for black defendants to re-offend than for white defendants. And when in fact that wasn't actually the case, but also the fact that it would just pick up these things by race would be considered something that might lead to discrimination. The third one is related to a chatbot from Microsoft that got trolled by users, and it was trained, it was implemented to be trained to learn from what people tell it. And within the space of a few hours, it turned quite racist and sexist. And that wasn't the intention of the designers. It was just that they hadn't anticipated the malicious behavior of users who tried to influence this chatbot. And the final one is obviously physical harm. So there's a lot of talk around autonomous weapons. There's a lot of talk around self-driving cars. The picture you can see here on the right is about the Moral Machines experiment, which was run by people at MIT, and it was about trying to get users' views, citizens' views on cases of where you can't avoid an accident, and then should you go for what decision should a self-driving car make regarding what the most moral option is. So, for example, if you have to harm young people or old people, should you choose the young people or the old people? And of course, these are difficult moral dilemmas. So, as we're seeing that AI gets deployed in all these different domains by government, by companies, by the manufacturers of self-driving cars and so on, we have to think about what we can do to make sure the AI is trusted and safe and beneficial for humanity. So, as some of you will know, there are a lot of initiatives around the world trying to discuss these potential effects, consequences of AI technology, trying to come up with guidance and with methods for making AI safe. And on this slide, I've just listed a list that was put together a couple of years ago by the WE Forum, and it summarizes the key aspects where AI could raise critical ethical questions. A lot of these are about unemployment and inequality. Some of them are more about very fundamental issues like what does AI mean for how humans behave, how will it impact how humans behave, how can we keep the AI safe from attack. So if it does very clever things and very impactful things, how can we keep the AI itself safe? How do we make sure we don't let the genie out the bottle? How do we make sure the singularity doesn't lead to some future world where machines control us because they are vastly more intelligent than us? And should robots have rights? So these are just some of the key questions that are being asked, and obviously that's a very wide range of issues that can't all be addressed at the same time, and yet society and governments and politicians and business people are asked to come up with answers to make sure AI benefits humanity. On this slide I've just listed a few initiatives. I won't go through all of those, but I think one of the key messages here is that lots of different organizations, companies, government agencies, NGOs and research groups are trying to come up with different initiatives, sometimes industry-led, sometimes government-led, sometimes grassroots, sometimes academic, to understand this area better and understand the implications and come up with concrete guidance and guidelines for the development of these technologies. So we're maybe at the same point that maybe nuclear technology was at a few decades ago, and then biotechnology, and of course these issues are also important in medicine and other high-risk domains. But I think for AI, this until recently, even though there has been work on machine ethics and AI ethics for for quite a long time, it's only now that because we're seeing so much potential impact, a lot of people are waking up to this issue. There was a report from AI Now in 2017, which I think went some way towards actually making some recommendations. These are still quite high level, but I think they're instructive in terms of, in my view, there is not a lot more than this list that you can say at the general level. So unless you go into particular applications and particular technologies. So what they say is all the public agencies that are using AI should not use black box AI, should try to use systems that can provide some explanation, that can actually provide some understandable, give some metrics on what they do internally. And these systems should be tested before being released. Companies should monitor their functions. And there needs to be a better regulatory framework and more research into the use of AI systems. And we also need to understand the life cycle. So we need to understand where the data comes from, how it's used, how the data is, how the systems are trained, and what the life cycle is. As a lot of these systems are adaptive, their behavior will change over time, and that raises additional problems. AI research and mitigation should be expanded beyond a narrow technical approach. We should have standards for auditing and understanding the use of AI systems in the wild, in the real world, not just in an academic space or in prototypes and kind of nice demonstrators. And there should be more transparency around how women, minorities, other vulnerable groups, marginalized groups are considered in AI research and development. And the AI industry also needs expertise from other disciplines to make sure that everyone's empowered and everyone's rights are respected. And finally, there should be oversight and accountability. So I think this pretty much captures at the moment more or less the consent around what kind of needs to be done on a higher level. But that, of course, doesn't really tell us very easily what we should do in terms of developing these technologies. So on the next slide, I've kind of tried to lay out a dichotomy, which is to some extent a little bit artificial, but I think it tries to make a distinction between what I call AI ethics, so the things to do with the public debate, with the impact and the human and social factors that are relevant in the development of AI, and ethical AI on the other side, which when I use that term I refer to the actual technologies that will help make AI safer. So these two things obviously overlap, as I've already highlighted on the previous slides, and this is widely recognized that they need to work together. But I want to make an argument that the public debate and the kind of more human and social aspects, there is only so much more you can say on that than what has already been said, without actually then having to focus on developing, on learning how to develop AI systems based on this input. So this is kind of the argument I'm trying to make. Both sides are equally valuable, but I think there is a need to do much more on the left-hand side. There is a need to do much more on the development of technologies, because unless we are able to implement the requirements that come from society, we will not actually have reasonable guarantees, or at least risk mitigation strategies to keep people safe as AI gets more and more widely adopted. I should also say on this slide there's a third part to this diagram that is about data ethics, and that's obviously another big area that overlaps with AI, but is also about a lot of things like privacy and surveillance and cybersecurity and consent and use of personal data, and those are all very, very important issues. But I think it's important when we talk about AI to focus on those things that are specific to AI rather than just the general landscape of data ethics. So here is a hierarchy, I think, of different factors that we need to consider in the design of such trusted systems if we really want to make sure they can be trusted by humans. And I like to think of this as a layer cake with kind of 4 levels that all overlap, and they are to do with issues around keeping people safe, with issues around respecting people, and issues around generating benefit for humanity. So at the safety level, we have security and privacy. We have to make sure that people, that the systems actually work, that they don't leak information, that they can't be hacked, and so on. And privacy is related to that, but goes a little bit beyond that, which it's about whether we actually respect people's right to privacy. So rather than just keeping their data safe, it's also about respecting their right to privacy and not gathering or using information about them that shouldn't be used. This is part of kind of a respect agenda, which then also reaches into the area of fairness. So fairness is about avoiding discrimination and bias. about being equitable when we use systems to allocate resources, allocate benefit, allocate harm where necessary. And then finally, social good, which is to do with whether a system is actually promoting positive values and actually benefiting humanity. This may not be important for all systems. You can imagine some fairly simple or fairly non-safety critical applications, like a simple app to help people do something on the web. Doesn't necessarily have to prove that it benefits humanity, but of course in other domains like social justice and crime, or for example financial services, or for example where systems are used by government, of course we have to make sure that the total kind of moral balance sheet of a system that uses AI and the socio-technical processes within which that's embedded is leads to an overall positive balance. So when we think about, I made the argument that if we want to make these trusted systems, we have to work on the technological side of these things, and it's worth thinking about what that might mean in terms of looking at these AI systems as agents in a complex web of different stakeholders that interact with each other. And I think it's important to point out that there are different levels of this. So having an ethical impact, an ethically positive impact, does not necessarily require that these agents are very smart and that they can reason about the full ethical implications of their actions and make judgments. On this scale defined by Moore a few years ago, that would be kind of the highest level of ethical agency, so under item 4 there. But it could be weaker forms. So sometimes, for example, when we have a watch at the lowest level, that has actually ethical consequences. So, for example, whether people arrive at their meetings on time, or whether we actually punish someone for delaying a train. But they have no sense of what those consequences are. It's the same with a seatbelt, for example. It does positive things, but it doesn't have any awareness of that. At the second level, you have kind of implicit ethical agents where the design already considers the ethics. So, of course, when you have safety-critical infrastructures or machinery like airplanes, of course, ethical considerations have been built into them, but there is no ethical agency. And then the next level would be where agents can actually process some ethical information. So you could tell them what you want them to do and make some sensitive decisions about what decisions, about how they should judge situations or what output they should produce. So my own research has been a lot around understanding fairness, issues to do with fairness, and how that could be how we could work towards this third level of embedding these ethical principles in an agent so that its algorithm actually makes appropriate decisions. I want to just briefly go over, before talking about a little bit of what we've done in my own research, I want to briefly go over different methodologies one can use in the design of such systems. So I became very interested in how in the technical design we can actually take ethical principles into account, and there's a number of different strategies one can use, and I will not go into each of these in depth, but I think they give you a flavor of what the important implications are for methodology in terms of development of technology. So value-sensitive design is the first one. So this focuses a lot of on values. So this focuses a lot of emphasizing the nature of systems that involves a lot of different stakeholders. It's not specific to AI. It doesn't actually say that if you apply it, you will solve all problems. But what it does is it goes through 4 stages where you try to discover the values, you conceptualize them, you do some empirical investigation around those values, and then you try to use that for technical values through an investigation that then gives you design guidelines. So the first step involves understanding who the direct and indirect stakeholders are. So this is very important. Sometimes we can think of direct stakeholders as the users of the system, but sometimes people who might be most affected might be the people who don't use the system, for example, because you have access to certain benefits by using the system. And then you think about things like what harms and benefits are caused by the system from the perspective of these stakeholders, and how do these map to their values. So to respect all the stakeholders, of course, one needs to understand what values they have, and that is then the second step, where you try to actually articulate what these values are and identify the tensions between them. And I think this is the most critical and difficult thing in an ethical assessment of a potential technology, because we all know that systems exist for a reason and that somebody has built them to reflect their own values or their own objectives. But the difficult thing is in judging what the tensions are. And also in the third stage, investigating empirically how much these values matter to people, right? So we have found, for example, quite often that people understand that certain online platforms affect their privacy, but there is a segment of the user population that does not view that as a major harm. So that's important in actually making an assessment. We should not, as the researchers or as the analysts or as the designers, make these judgments on behalf of the stakeholders. We should really understand what they want and what they think. And then finally, you do an investigation of kind of different options you have, and you try to design systems in such a way that negative experiences are avoided. The value-sensitive design framework is there's quite a strong relationship to a broader framework which is called AREA. So that's an acronym that stands for Anticipate, Reflect, Engage, Act. And this is mainly designed for research and innovation projects, but you can actually also apply it to standard technology development. It's not specifically tailored to AI problems, and it's really based on a very, there are quite involved elaborations of this, but the key principle is really to think before you act. The key principle is to anticipate the possible impacts and risks some technology could have before you start developing it. Reflect on those, engage with the relevant stakeholders, and then take action, which, and by taking action, that means actually making decisions that will be relevant for your design, or deciding to actually change that design, and so on. And the idea is that at every time you are changing something, you're innovating in some way, you go through this cycle. So this slide shows some of the questions. I don't want to go through all of them, but what's important about this is to really think about process, product, purpose, and people, and to ask all these questions. So for example, when you anticipate, on the people side, you want to ask things like, have you considered the right stakeholders? On the process side, you need to consider whether the research methodology you are applying is acceptable. And to just pick a different phase, like the engage phase, there are difficult questions like, when it comes to the people side of things, who prioritizes research, right? Why did we choose to do this? And you can apply this equally to product development. Why do we choose to actually develop this precise thing we're developing? So the methodologies around this that exist have quite a lot of detail on all of these questions. And even though they seem quite generic, I think that it's still quite a challenge to embed this in the process of technology development, because a lot of engineers and software developers haven't actually been trained with this kind of mindset. One thing, a process model that has been proposed more specifically for data-driven decision-making. So again, this is not necessarily AI, but I'm highlighting this because it's very relevant for a lot of the current AI systems that are being developed. A lot of them are based on machine learning and data science and data analytics. And this is a model that was put forward by an NGO called Algorithm Watch. And it actually really highlights the different stages that are all relevant to the ethical development of systems. So it highlights that there are many different stages where decisions need to be made and who needs to make these decisions, and where one needs to think about what the implications will be of the decisions made in that stage. For example, in the very early stages, you are developing your analytic method, you are pre-selecting some data and collecting the data and implementing the system. A lot of the decisions made there, of course, already can have an impact further down the line. So, for example, if you pre-select data and the data is not representative of the entire population, you might embed algorithmic bias in your data analytics. Further down the line, the data scientists may only be able, although they may be somewhat involved in implementation and data collection, a lot of that may have been done before they come into the pipeline, and very often it may be the case that they cannot uncover some implicit assumptions at the point of modeling the problem and trying to provide kind of intelligence based on that. And also then they might be, together with other stakeholders from business, government and so on, be involved in interpreting the result. And this is a very, very important stage. Even if all our systems were perfect, we know that humans are not perfect, and we know that very often also their level of knowledge and cognitive ability can be compromised for various reasons. And so one needs to be conscious that a lot of that is affected by what has happened before. And then finally, when this interpretation leads to action, leads to concrete decisions, then those are important factors that will have a bearing on the impact of the system. The final model I want to show, and this is something quite high level and informal in some ways and quite general. It's not really a methodology, but it's something that has been proposed again by colleagues I also worked with at MIT, who have this idea of viewing the whole process of developing advanced AI ethically as a model that they call society in the loop. So their argument is basically that in society you have stakeholders with conflicting interests and values. So for example, a company that wants to make profit and the users that want to keep their data safe and make sure they're not treated unfairly, and maybe government that needs to regulate and get its fair share of taxes out of a certain platform. And that's even the case in society without any technology. So what we have in society is a social contract that regulates how we manage these relationships between these stakeholder groups that have conflicting interests and values. The idea is that when we have AI in the picture, we need some sort of algorithmic social contract, right? So what will happen is human controllers will develop and have oversight for AI systems. And because of these conflicting interests and values, some of the functions of these systems will be contested. They may be contested just by one group or by several groups on the basis of fundamental rights, ethical values, maybe just because they have different preferences and sometimes trade-offs have to be made. And the idea is that that would feed back to the human controller to adjust and update the design of the systems that are deployed in society. So what I will talk about for the rest of the webinar, just to give a sense for how such a thing might be achieved, is based on very much this concept of the idea of how do we actually develop systems that can take input from stakeholders, and then we as designers can make choices about how to improve our designs to align them with the values of human users. So I focused on fairness. Fairness is quite a complex issue. It can be interpreted in many different ways. Many people apply it to mean equity or social justice. Sometimes it's more about procedural justice. Do we apply the same procedure to everyone? It's closely related to discrimination, right? So we don't want to make distinctions in favor of or against groups based on a category they belong to. Note that it's, for most people, perfectly fine to make distinctions because of the individual behavior, but not because they just belong to some category that they can't influence. And what's also relevant here is the notion of entitlement. So sometimes we want to consider needs of people to allocate benefit to them. So if you think about an economy, you know, who are the people in need? Who should we distribute some wealth to, even regardless of what they do, just because they are in need? And then rights are quite similar, but sometimes it's also merit. Right? Sometimes we say, well, people should get more if they work harder, people should get more if they have achieved more in the past, and we have limited resources, and or also because of property. So, for example, in capitalist societies, you have a right to charge interest or get rent on your property just because you own it, right? So it's a lot of the theories of fairness are based on what your underlying notion of equality and entitlement is, and need versus merit. On the internet, there are lots of things people might consider unfair. I've just made a list here. Some of these things are, for some of these there is evidence, for some of them there is not. People don't want to feel that information is used that actually affects how they are treated by a system and differentiates between different users, especially if it's without their knowledge. And this can happen in all kinds of ways, some of which I've listed on this slide. So fairness is definitely an issue on online platforms. What we really know quite little about is how we should embed different notions of fairness in these systems and how we know what people want. So game theory is an area where this has been studied a lot outside of technical systems. So there are different criteria that have been proposed here in economics. So we know this is a setting where everybody has different preferences. We can't keep everyone happy because resources are limited. So if you think about, for example, a job search website, not everybody can be the top result for a search. Not everybody can get the last flight ticket. So resources are limited, and we have to make choices when there is conflict of interest. So the setting here is that there is some algorithm, a mechanism that computes a global decision, and it has some understanding or assumptions about what everybody wants. So everybody reports what their preferences are, and the system tries to somehow allocate benefit, knowing that it can't make everyone happy. Now there are many fairness criteria in game theory. I'll just mention a few. The most basic one is social welfare. So the best solution is the solution that maximizes the sum of everyone's utility, everyone's benefit. This doesn't, of course, take into account how different people are between themselves. It just looks at the total efficiency of the system. There are other criteria like envy-freeness. Would you be happier if you got something different from what you got, something that somebody else got? Pareto efficiency compares different solutions and says, well, one solution would be surely better if it can make at least one person happier without making anybody less happy. Again, there is no notion of balance. It's just, you can have a very imbalanced solution, and it can be Pareto optimal simply because you can't find one that would make nobody less happy. Proportionality. is very much about merit. So if you're contributing to a total outcome, you should have some revenue or some benefit that is proportional to that. There are quite complex measures for that. For the people among you who may know about cooperative games, Shapley value is a very clever way of calculating that. So thinking about how you contribute to every possible combination of people to measure what you should get. And more of those, and I don't want to go into all of those. Maybe just the final one, maximin, is an important one that people in the theory of justice have proposed. So you know that you should look at the person who is worst off and try to come up with a mechanism that makes them least worse off. So when you think about the society in the loop idea, so let's say we have a certain problem and we want to distribute this kind of the benefit using an algorithm. How should we do that? And so what we have done in a project I've been involved in is work a lot with users. All right, so we brought young people, teenagers, and sometimes students, and sometimes older people into a room, and we discussed with them how algorithms work, how they use data. We developed quite a lot of educational tools to help them explore what matters to them, understand their values, understand their concerns, and this was very instructive because it also tells you something about how little many people understand about algorithms and AI, and how much work needs to be done to help them actually make informed decisions. And one thing we did there, and this is an experiment with university students, was really trying to ask this question: how do we use the views of users to decide between different algorithmic designs? So this is a setting where we gave them 5 algorithms. We didn't tell them what these algorithms are, A1 to A5, and we just gave them a couple of metrics. We just said, okay, each of them there's a different number for total utility, so the sum of everyone's utility. So this is an allocation problem. So let's say, for example, you are picking which rooms you would prefer in university accommodation, and then there is some algorithm who allocates everyone to a specific room given on what they wanted. So this would be the sum of the benefit that everyone got under each different algorithm. And the other one is the total distance. So this is the pairwise difference between everyone's happiness. So this is some measure of how different the outcome was for everyone compared to everyone else. We also told them what the distribution of utility and distance was for everybody. So on the left-hand side here, you can see the blue points are every individual participant and how much utility they got. So for example, in algorithm 3, you can see quite a lot of people got 7, which was the top they could get. In algorithm 5, quite a lot of them got 4. The red diamond is the average, just as an illustrative metric. And on the right-hand side, you can see the distance. So this is for everyone, on average, how far were they apart from everybody else. So if you look at that distribution, it tells you something about how equitable each algorithm is. And you can see that there are trade-offs, right? You can see, for example, that A5 is very egalitarian, hardly any distance between anybody, but actually people also don't do very well overall. Most of them just make a utility of 4. On the other hand, for example, A2 and A3 have quite similar utility distributions, but and A3 is even better in terms of equity, in terms of distance. So we showed them this without telling them what the algorithms are, and then after that we told them what the algorithms actually do. So on this slide you can see the description of that. So let's go backwards. A5 just minimizes total distance, makes everybody equally happy as far as possible. That's of course not entirely possible because you only have so many rooms you can allocate, or so many rides on Uber, or so many rooms on Airbnb. So you can't keep everybody happy because there is resource limitations, but it tries to do that. Algorithm 4 tries to maximize the utility of the least happy person. Now it turns out in this particular example, this is not actually very different from the other algorithms, and that raises an important problem because the design objective of an algorithm doesn't necessarily tell you anything about how it will perform on a particular problem instance, right? So there is a difference here between the objective and the performance that is generated in a specific scenario. And then algorithm 3 maximizes total utility, and algorithm 1 and 2 are a mix of guaranteeing total utility and maximizing one of the other criteria. So the interesting thing was we then asked people, before telling them what the algorithms do, what they think, which one they prefer, and after telling them what the algorithms do. What was very interesting was that two observations. So algorithm 5 was not very much favored by many people, but after we told them that it just really makes everyone the same, then suddenly nobody preferred it anymore. This is a small case, this is a summary of a small-scale experiment, but the results were similar in bigger ones. And the typical comment was that this is communism. This makes everybody poor just to make everyone the same. We also observed that those kinds of statements were also quite different across different cultures. So egalitarian algorithms, for example, were more preferred in continental Europe than when we did this in the United Kingdom or in the US. With, of course, every time a different set. So, we don't want to generalize these statements, but different groups may have different priorities, and this is an important insight. The other interesting thing was that we observed that A2, so remember A2 is the algorithm that tries to maximize the minimum utility and guarantee some overall efficiency. And actually, after telling them what the algorithms do, many more people liked that algorithm. So they seem to like the idea that we're trying to help the weakest. So even though A3 seems to perform better overall, they like that idea, which is interesting because it tells you something about what information you give people really affects their judgment, because it relates in different ways to values they may hold and which may not be explicit and which they may not even mention. So this is a difficult design issue because it also means that you could manipulate them. You could, by giving them different types of information, you could basically convince them potentially to like what you've implemented. So there's another difficult question in this space. The next slide, just some comments on what they said. Some very interesting ideas there. There seemed to be quite a lot of comments that were about not making a lot of people unhappy, not making people way too different, not making people not being left behind alone. So it's okay if some people don't perform that well, but it's not acceptable if this just disadvantages one or two people individually and everybody else is doing fine. So there are kind of complex notions of justice there, and but there are also certain things that are not as easily implemented in algorithms. So for example, this comment about while still resulting in people being unhappy, ensure that most people are as happy as possible. So it's typically quite difficult for optimization algorithms and for AI algorithms to do this in terms of how many people get what outcome. So that's difficult to consider in the design of algorithms. Or an entirely different suggestion, the bottom suggestion, running separate algorithms in parallel and on every instance, and only using the one that aligns most with certain values on a case-by-case basis. So this would mean not committing the system to a particular way of working, but actually knowing what users want and then judging each individual outcome on its merits and not being tied down to a specific algorithm. This is an interesting thing about being pragmatic and actually user-focused rather than what a computer scientist or an AI a designer would like, which would be to discover the best optimization criterion. And to some extent, users are saying here, well, maybe you don't need to have the best one and the single one. Maybe you can change around at every single step just to make sure that you satisfy the requirements of the user community. So to conclude, I just want to repeat this point that, you know, as we do more, as we have more and more debate around the implications of AI, if we don't do the technical research to push the technologies forward in a human-centric way, then a lot of this debate is just speculation. And this speculation is fun, but it doesn't necessarily actually make it more likely that we will have a positive AI future. And for those of us who are technologists, I think we need to both understand what the requirements are that come out of society and what the technical ways of implementing those requirements are, and where there are real challenges around doing that. So in the examples I gave from my own research, the challenges were around getting a clear understanding of what the users would want, then doing something around how we strike a compromise when different groups want different things. So this is still an unsolved problem, and I think it's a fundamental problem because it might mean, well, the systems have to be split up for different communities with different objectives, or it might mean that we have to make everybody happy to some extent, but we can't keep everybody, we can't align with everyone's different values at the same time. And also that it's really difficult to elicit these values. People don't know a lot about the workings of AI systems. It's hard for them to assess what's possible, what's, you know, they may worry, they may have unjustified fears, they may also have very justified fears. We may also downplay lots of things that are actually dangerous. And so that's training people and learning how to better involve the human and social factors in the development of technologies is really key. And it's really just to say that for most of this type of research that we need to do in the future, we don't really know how to do it. And we're only learning how to do it across different disciplines. And this will require a lot of different things, from algorithm development to the right governance frameworks for this type of research and software development, and participatory design that actually engages the user and all relevant stakeholders every step of the way. This all sounds incredibly complicated. It has been done in other areas. It is done, for example, in medical research. It is done in some biological research and in other domains where people have recognized that there are major societal benefits to be reaped, but also major societal risks from a certain technology or from a certain scientific discipline. And I think we just have to own up to the risks that are there and to the opportunities that are there, and take this responsibility and go with it. At the end of the day, this is about difficult questions around the future. So are we looking at a future where the AI manipulates us, or where it works with us hand in hand? Are we looking at personalization or surveillance? Are we looking at collective intelligence and the wisdom of crowds? Or are we looking at just becoming human workers in the service of AI systems, just producing data? So these are hard choices for society. The people who have the expertise need to answer these questions. It's hard work, but very exciting work. And I hope this webinar has given you some ideas on important directions and methodological ways one can approach this. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I hope this has been interesting. And I will now try to look at some of the questions that have come in. And but before doing that, thank you very much, and then I'll try to look at the questions. So we have one question which is about whether ethical guidelines have an effect on the people who actually create these systems using machine learning. I think I wish I had the answer to this. And the question is really, so we are aware that big AI companies, also big other institutions and for example in professional services, in finance and so on, are thinking about these methodologies, are thinking about developing tools, and are thinking about educating their data scientists and machine learning experts to use these things. But it's hard to understand, it's hard to get a good picture of what the rate of adoption is. So everybody is currently trying to have these conversations, but it's very difficult to look behind the scenes and see how many people are considering these sorts of guidelines in industry in particular. We know that governments around the world are definitely all engaged, many of them are engaging in initiatives to embed these guidelines at least in their public policy and procurement procedures for systems and so on. What can we do to impact the practice in industry? I think one thing that is needed is really much more training. Everybody who is watching this and who is at a university, I would really encourage everyone to think about what can be done about training engineers, what can be done about training data scientists and computer scientists, because I think we're quite far behind. I think, for example, in the traditional engineering disciplines, there is a body of work on safety critical systems, on testing, on validation, on safety checking, and there are quite high standards around doing that. But in information technology, unfortunately, we don't have that history, and I think we're just at the starting point. So I think education and training and the development of curricula is really essential. Next question. In systems like self-driving cars, where an error might lead to physical risks, do the same suggestions for optimization apply? Very interesting question. I think there is a kind of almost trivial truth, which is that, well, you will have, by definition, every algorithm will try to optimize towards something. Now, the principle, the criteria I've suggested as possibilities are not necessarily the best ones for every application, and there may be different ones, and there is a deeper methodological question, which is if you wanted to use these algorithms that I've suggested, for example, when deciding who to harm in a critical situation, then the problem there might be how do you even evaluate how much that is worth to calculate something. So that's a fundamental question. And if you have, so in those cases, I think what people are trying to do is trying to have kind of a mix of understanding what people care about, but also having kind of very high-level normative principles. For example, you may decide that because you should not judge on age, that you will just take this out of the loop, and then maybe if you need to either run over a child or over an old person, you will just toss a coin. Even though that's not very satisfactory, you might want to do these things just because you don't want to have an explicit preference. Another question is, a system that works well for most people might put specific racial groups at some risk. I think this is very true, and there is a big issue around algorithmic bias. The main problem is, of course, if the bias is unintended. So we are allowed to sometimes, we are compelled to ignore things like race directly, but what happens sometimes is that features in the data act as proxies. So, for example, more black people may have lower income, so if you're using income, maybe you're not intending to use race, but you detect a pattern on income anyway, and this is what has happened in past systems. For example, systems that determine whether you're awarded a business loan. And there are these implicit biases, and sometimes they are down to human bias, and we have to be careful about the data we use, but sometimes they are also just exacerbated by algorithms. And there is currently a lot of work going on into better, fairer statistical machine learning algorithms that eradicate these biases. Do you think we can get to a good point in fairness of these systems, or should we stop working on those? No, I think we definitely haven't reached a point where we know it doesn't work. So I definitely think more work is needed. The next question: what about young people? Is there a plan for nurturing critical thinking in the use of technology? So if you're asking whether there is a plan globally, I think this is a big challenge, and I don't think that this is actually finding its ways into schools and into places where this type of education can be delivered at scale. What we are definitely trying to do is we're trying to do these things locally in our own research projects and here in Edinburgh and with other, I know of many other initiatives that are trying to do the same. But you're absolutely right, this needs to happen at a young age. In particular, it needs to happen at a young age because it's very easy to accept technologies as something that's given, especially when you're growing up with them, rather than something that you can actually influence through your opinion. We've had quite some fairly worrying experiences with teenagers in many of our discussions which showed that they were very aware of the risks. However, they did not really feel empowered. They didn't really think government could do anything about that, or they could do anything about that. And that worries me. And I think there is a role there for policymakers and for educators to take this forward. And I think also there is something around a transnational way of doing this. So these systems are typically not confined to a country. Of course, there are big online platforms, or if you think about the self-driving cars, there are likely to be international manufacturers, and so it's not just a national issue. So, for example, in Europe, I think the EU and European countries have actually worked out that the issues of safe AI and responsible innovation, and this started with things like GDPR and so on, but this flavor of AI innovation with a kind of clear social conscience and attitude to delivering beneficial impact is actually, in fact, a key point where Europe is trying to distinguish itself from some parts of Asia or North America. And I think that's very important. I think there is a big role the EU can play, and also European institutions, national institutions, and international initiatives can play. So we have in AI we have now two big initiatives called Claire and Alice that actually work on develop transnational networks of AI research, and also want to try to coordinate more about the public debate. And I think that's very, very important. And sometimes it's more useful to do regulation also at a transnational level rather than only nationally, especially when these systems have international impact. Okay, I think we've run out of time. I'd like to thank everyone again for their attention, and also for the many interesting and stimulating questions. And I hope you have enjoyed this, and that you will tune in to future webinars from the CyCAT project. Thank you very much.